question would be about micro, low budget indie filmmaking. So because the market's so oversaturated now, because it's essentially easier to make a feature film, do you think it's worth it making a feature film in the micro budget, like, $5,000 to 10, 20? Think it's worth it now, or do you think it stick out because you're competing with, all the indie films out there?
That's a great question. I would say that depending on what your goals are, it may be very well worth it. If you're only making the movie because you want to sell it and make money with the movie, then you might want to think twice about doing something on such a low budget, because traditionally those movies are really hard. It's hard to find an audience with them, and not that you can't do it, but there are no guarantees. So if that's your only intention, I would say you might be better off taking a different path. At the same time, if you have other goals as well, if you want to improve your craft, if you want to build an audience for yourself, if you want to potentially use it as a calling card to, let's say land an agent or a manager who may be able to help you in the future with, a larger scale feature film, then there's really nothing like doing a micro budget feature, in the sense that you get to do, see the whole process through from end to end. You learn so much. Other people, if you're able to pull it off, I think are, somewhat impressed by that. So yeah, I think it all sort of comes down to your goals. But, as long as they're not only financially driven, then I think it could be a really good thing.
Do you think versus a short film versus a feature film, because you can kind of use a short film for essentially the same thing as a calling card, and maybe even make it as a proof of concept? Do you think it's worth doing short films, investing, or do you think it's better to just invest in a feature?
Yeah, I do think shorts are really, really important. And I think it's sort of up to everyone to decide when they feel comfortable making the jump. And sometimes making the jump back. We worked together on this feature that just came out, but since then, I did this tiny little short film, and then, maybe I'll do another feature next, and then maybe another short. So I think everyone's sort of different in terms of what kind of project they want to be working on. But I do think that before you make a feature, you should at least make a couple of short films. Just because there's so much to learn when you make a movie, and for a feature to really be able to have the legs that you want it to, and reach a bigger audience, and do all the things that we talked about already, then you don't really want to be starting from ground zero. So ideally, you have 2-3 short films under your belt, then maybe you make a feature. But at the same time, there are people that I've come across who have never made a short film. They made a feature and they knocked it out of the park their first time. It's rare, but it does happen. But generally speaking, I'd say it's always a good idea to do a couple of shorts first.
So what happens when you get a financer? How do you deal with the financer with contracts, percentages, and things like that? How do you know when it's right to bring on a financer, and if they're the right one?
For sure. That's another great question. I think that it's right when, there's something outside of your own scope that you want to do that's not within your means financially, and you can't make the movie without it. So I'm speaking strictly from like a creative standpoint. If you're a director or writer, you want to get a film off the ground, I would only really look for investment if there's no other way that you could do it for yourself, at least on your early films. Because it can sometimes take 2 years to raise financing, even for a really, really low budget movie. And then you could be spending all that time otherwise, just making the movie, or working a little bit more and saving money and making your own movie. So I think it's always a tough call when to do that. But I do think if you're going to go for financing, you want to also make sure that it's that there's name, the ability to attach name talent to your movie. That's really on the low budget model what money is most valuable for, because as you make these amazing short films, and you're able to capture great production value with a small team, and a relatively low cost gear. So that's not really the issue anymore. The issue is, can you find an audience? And what money can sometimes buy you is, a well-known actor, which is something I'm thinking about for my next feature. I've not shot any features with stars in them. But if you can get a cameo from a known actor, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's also going to increase the value of your film substantially. So I would say that's something to consider. But to be more practical, I know that entertainment lawyers are a great way to ultimately find financing. You talked a little bit about like contracts and negotiation and all of that, which a lot of that stuff honestly goes over my head because I don't have a background in any of the legal sort of areas of this business. But a lot of entertainment lawyers are really well connected to financiers and investors. So if you're thinking about raising money, I'd say your first step is probably to attach an entertainment lawyer. And then that person may or may not even be able to point you in the direction of some money for your movie. At the very least, they'll be a sounding board when you need some advice as far as contracts and that sort of thing.
So I was taking into a director role. How do you prepare as a director in pre-production?
Well, it's funny. I mean, on a film like this, everything kind of happens at the same time, and referring in particular to psychosynthesis, which obviously you were involved with, especially during production very heavily, and in pre-production a little bit too, because on a lot of my films, I produce as well as direct. It's just honestly a little bit messy during pre-production. There's a lot of trying to balance so many different things, and wearing the producer hat and then taking that off and then focusing on the creative stuff. Mm-hmm. So all of that kind of gets mixed together. But the main things that I always want to prioritize creatively during pre-production are shot listing, because I'm a big believer that if you don't visualize what you're doing before you get to set, then you're going to spend a lot of time on set just kind of unsure of what to do. And, that's time that you could be spending shooting. So shot listing is huge. Location scouting is also huge, because on low budget indies, if your locations don't work, chances are you're only shooting in maybe 2, 3, 4 locations if it's a really low budget film. So then the production value is really going to suffer. So I like to spend a lot of time on locations, time rewriting the script, if possible, doing like a rehearsal or 2 or 3 with the actors. Those sort of things are really, really important to me. But yeah, I'd say the shot list is really always the starting point for me during pre-production.
You're talking about locations and things like that, and that got me thinking about, do you think it's good to alter your story to the locations that you can have, or do you think it's better to raise the money and figure it out for the story that you want to tell? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, in my case, I would say normally I would do the former. I would sort of try to look at what my resources are and write a story that's going to fit within that scope. So I may not necessarily have a location in mind already, but I might know the general cost. So again, using our feature as an example, psychosynthesis, there were 2 houses. I didn't know right off the bat when I wrote the script that we would be able to shoot in these 2 houses, but I knew that, looking on some of these location scouting websites, that for a relatively low cost, I would be able to afford for 9 days, like 4 days in one house, 5 days in another. I didn't know which houses they would be, but I knew the general cost. So I do think that you want to write with your limitations in mind. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to write for your house or your friend's pool or whatever. That's great as a bonus if you can do that. But just make sure whatever locations you're writing in are doable, are affordable, even if you have to pay for them. And ideally, if you can write in as much as possible above and beyond that, like really amazing resources. Like if you're, you have a spouse that works at a high school and you want to shoot in a high school, and normally that would cost a lot of money and you could get in there. that's an example of something you might want to write into the script from the get-go.
How do you know, or how do you focus on what story idea to work on next? I know there's different
Well, that's
options.
something. Yeah, I'm struggling a bit with that right now, so it's a very timely question. But normally, it usually builds off of whatever the previous project was. So I always start my whatever creative thing I'm doing, kind of hoping to learn, grow, and do something a little better than I did before. So when I was first starting, it was just I just want to make a short film so I could do something that's finished, and then it was okay. How do I make a short film that's a little bit better, or that takes maybe a creative element that did work in the last film, and now it's going to expand on that, and the whole film is going to be about that thing, or painted with that sort of style. So with a feature, I still feel the same way. I did this feature a few years ago, Shadows on the Road, and it was the first feature I actually fully completed and released. And when I looked back on it, there's a lot I was happy with, but there were some parts that I wish I expanded on more. Like I wanted it to be a little more stylized. I wanted to see more of the sort of suspense elements that I lost a little bit in the edit. So for the next feature, I basically tried to write it from a place of suspense and thriller as opposed to drama, and then injecting drama into it later. So for my next film, I don't know exactly what the film will be. I'm thinking about that now because I'm wanting to start writing something, and I'm kind of on the edge of that. But I think that it's going to take a few weeks to probably try to digest what I just released, and then see where do I want to go next, and where can I improve, where can I explore some new territory. And as a general rule of thumb, this is the age-old advice, but I think it's so relevant, which is people always say write what you know.
Mhm.
And I think that's something I want to do more of, because I've never really made a more sort of personal story or something that's drawn from reality in any way. So I think that's something that I want to definitely explore. All of those things, I guess, collectively are more or less the starting point for me whenever I'm embarking on a new project.
I noticed personal stories are really popular right now. Like back in the times of Jaws and Star Wars, it was the fantasy stories, but now it's like true stories.
Yeah.
Do you think that's beneficial to tell a true story, to follow that? Or do you think, we'll go back to the audiences, will go back to craving like the total fictional stories?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think a lot of audiences will. I think the good news is the audience has become so large globally because of VOD and everything, that I think almost no matter what kind of movie you make, you're going to probably find an audience for it. But to speak to your question, which is the general trend that people really like movies right now that are like smaller, like Lady Bird, or those kind of more personal, smaller movies are doing really well, and that's awesome. But I think it's hard to say. It's hard to kind of chase the trend and try to project where people are going to be at a year or two from now when my movie's actually done and released. It's almost impossible to know. The one thing that's great though about personalizing a story is it doesn't necessarily need to be, let's say, like a Lady Bird type of really personal drama to be a personal story. It could be a sci-fi movie, but maybe there's some theme that's about like feeling alienated just as a human, and it's really drawing on your feeling growing up in elementary school or something, but you're injecting that emotion into a story that takes place in outer space or whatever. So I think there's always a way to personalize. But whether or not you want to like really make it the story of your life, I think that's a different question, and that's when you have to really be careful, because a lot of times we feel that our own life story is super interesting, and
Yeah.
it is on paper, but it might not actually translate that well to film. So you have to be cognizant, I guess, of all that.
Going back to directing, what do you think are the most important aspects that a director can have?
I think Probably from my perspective, I think all directors, first and foremost, should understand writing, because I know that was an area I didn't really care to focus too much on writing early on. And then later I came around to it and I realized it really opens up your palette as a director to kind of understand how to write a script, read scripts. Even if you're not planning to write and direct your own material, you can still potentially benefit by, you know, taking other people's material. If you really understand the format of the screenplay and what it's supposed to be doing, it's going to make you a better director, whether you're writing it yourself or not. The other big thing I think is working with actors, just understanding how to speak their language, taking acting classes, interacting. I think these days everybody is so hung up on cameras, and I am too. I mean, I'm totally guilty of that. But at some point, it can almost be to the detriment of the performances, which is really what everybody's seeing. And anybody today, thankfully, can make a pretty nice looking movie, even on their phone or on a DSLR and a laptop. You can make a pretty good quality movie. So that's not really the issue anymore. The issue is like, are the performances good? Is the story good? Is it edited well? So I think those sort of fundamental basics you want to focus on, because really, in my opinion, a director's biggest job is to, you know, tie together all of these different parts and make them feel congruent with each other. And, you know, and a lot of us instinctually as directors know a little bit about cameras, or whether it's from photography or cinematography. We know a little bit about editing, but some of us don't have as much experience in the acting department or the writing department. So so those are definitely two areas that I think people should always consider focusing on.
When you're directing a performance, what are your techniques? Maybe like, let's say you're trying to pull a performance from an actress. How would you go about doing that?
I think it would depend on the actor, and generally speaking, I try to make sure whoever I cast in my films is as close as possible to what I'm looking for. I've made the mistake in the past of casting people who are really great actors, but maybe weren't right for the role. And then we've had to sort of butt heads or work through scenes in a way that was really challenging because we just had two different visions. So I think it always starts with casting the right people. And then personally, what I like to do, and everyone approaches this a bit differently, but what I like to do is always have the actors just try out the scene by themselves, do one or two takes with no direction, just to see what they do naturally, because they may have an idea that totally surprises me or that is better than what I was picturing. And I want to see that first. And then from there, we'll tweak things. So sometimes it's really close, and there might just be one line where I want something really specific, like, hey, let's just take a little bit more of a beat before this line. Everything else is perfect. It might be as simple as that. Or if something is really, really not working, and there's more than one character in the scene, which there usually is, then that's usually a conversation with all of us. And I like to present, you know, those more difficult conversations as just that, as conversations, as opposed to as me just directing. Because, you know, if there are two people in a scene and something's not working, even if I try to micromanage every single line of dialogue, we're never going to get there, and the two actors are probably going to feel like, you know, not confident in their ability at a certain point. So I'd rather pull the two actors aside, say, okay, let's talk this through as a team. What's going on here? What can we fix? Sometimes we might need to even change dialogue, or we might change the blocking. And I'd like to be as collaborative as possible, because in my opinion, to get the best work out of an actor, you know, you have to be respectful of their process too, and not just sort of treat them like a puppet that's going to speak your words. Some people do that, I guess, and do it well, but I don't know. For me, I like to have that dialogue and ask questions, like, you know, instead of just saying your character would be mad here, like maybe instead saying, like, do you think your character would be upset at this point? And you know, why would your character be upset? And just start a conversation, because I think once actors actually, you know, once they can click into what's in your mind in a way that is understandable to them, then that's where their talents can really get unleashed.
Going into the cinematography and director relationship. How do you navigate that? Maybe let's say, well, I know you know a lot about cinematography, but if you don't, or even if you do, how would you navigate it?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the casting process for me in that if you get a DP who you know like their style is right in line with what you want to do, that's going to save you so many difficult days and conversations, I think, right off the bat. So that's really, really important. And then I think above and beyond that, assuming you have the right person on board, I think once you're on set, it's a matter of finding the balance between giving them input, but also letting them bring what you hired them to bring, their talents, their expertise. So early on, I like to have a lot of discussions before going to set about visual palettes, watching reference movies, showing mood boards, all that sort of stuff to figure out what we're trying to do on set. And then once we're there, it's really just a matter of us trying to balance that. And, you know, if maybe there's something that I would like to see that we had discussed that's not really happening on camera, then at least we have a bit of a shorthand where I could say, hey, remember that hazy look that I showed you with the backlight? And, you know, that's what I want to go for here. So I think those early discussions are so, so crucial. And I think you almost, on an indie film, on a micro budget film, you almost need to work with a DP who you trust so much that in a situation where you're not in the room, which happens occasionally, you know that they have your back and they're going to capture, you know, exactly what you would want, even if you know, are in a tight space and the door is closed and you can't get to the monitor. It's that type of relationship that I think really ends up paying off in the end.
And I have one last question.
Sure, yeah.
It has to do with the whole COVID. How do you think indie filmmakers, like, what do you think the future, I know that's a really big question, but how can maybe indie filmmakers benefit from this time? As, I don't know, I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. Well, you know, I actually think that's another great question because there are so many opportunities actually right now for filmmakers at different stages. So if you have a film that is ready to be released, just like our film was just released, this is an amazing time to do so on VOD because the playing field is totally leveled. You know, if you're in development for a feature, this is a great time to contact people to raise money because everybody's at home or like, you know, they're not in their usual routine. So I've generally found it easier to contact people for all sorts of things during this period because for whatever reason, everyone seems to be more receptive. But I would say that, you know, just using the time to be creative on your script level, on your story level. If you're not at the stage where you have a finished film or you have a finished script, one of the great things about this moment that we're in, and you know, if there is, you know, such a thing, because there's so many, you know, terrible things going on right now, but if there's a silver lining for filmmakers, it's that we don't have to feel this pressure right now to produce content because nobody's really able to do that with, you know, a few exceptions. So we don't have to necessarily rush through the writing process because we're being competitive with other filmmakers and we want to get our movie done in time for the Sundance deadline. Like, in a sense, it kind of takes the pressure off right now where you could just focus on writing, just focus on, you know, developing and maybe pulling a cast or a crew together and just doing things really, really slow and methodically. So eventually, when this whole situation is hopefully behind us, then you will have spent, you know, a year, 2 years developing this really amazing film that potentially you might have just, you know, rushed through in 3 months because you were so eager to get to set. And, you know, the best movies almost always are the ones that have a lot of that prep work done, a lot of that pre-production work put in. And, you know, more generally, I do think, you know, I'm not such a like a doomsday type person that thinks none of this stuff will come back. I know a lot of people are, and rightfully so, scared that, you know, what's the world going to look like? But I do tend to believe, you know, a year from now, let alone 2 years from now, I don't think things are going to look dramatically different from what they did a couple of years ago. I think we're in a very weird time right now that will pass. There will be some lasting changes, but I don't think movie theaters are going to be here probably forever. All those things I think are going to be here forever. So keep that in mind. My only advice, to those filmmakers is, just write, focus on ideas, focus on, trying to find actors and crew, and then be ready. So when things open back up, you can really hit the ground running.
And actually I know we kind of touched on this earlier, short films versus features, but I was thinking, what do you feel about proof of concepts? Do you think you should invest in money in a proof of concept, or do you think you should just save that money for the feature?
I would only personally invest in a proof of concept at this stage if there was a specific reason to do so. So let's say there's a producer who said, I love your last film, I like your script, but I'm not going to raise money for you, or I'm not going to cut you a check unless you can show me a scene. So I think that's kind of like what happened with Whiplash, the movie. They did like a proof of concept short. But those sort of movies are often more or less a guarantee that they are going to get turned into a feature. You just have to kind of go through the steps to make sure, that there's no major issues that you encounter, and that you can actually pull off what you're trying to pull off. So in those cases, I think it's a great idea. The only reason I don't love doing a proof of concept in other situations is because I've tried it for some films, and although it's generated interest, I found that it didn't necessarily lead to anything. Like, it generated interest from fans, let's say, but not from investors. And that's because they get constantly hit up with requests from people who have proof of concepts or have short films. Those people tend to show up when you don't need them. They're knocking on your door when you're just doing your thing, and they come across it at a film festival or on Vimeo or something. That's kind of when you hear from those people. So not to discourage anyone from doing it. Some movies, especially higher budget films, if you have a vision for like the next Hunger Games or something, then maybe you do need to make a proof of concept short film. And maybe that's the only way that it'll really get done. But again, speaking for me personally on the micro budget level, I have so little time, especially now that I have a baby and all these other things in my life. So I don't have as much time as I used to. So I'm trying to focus as much of that energy into actually making a finished product, as opposed to something that may become a finished product in the future. But again, that's just me. And I think everyone's kind of got to do it their own way.
All right. Well, I took more of your time, so I'll end it there, unless you have any last words to throw in.
No, I just thank you for having me on, and for doing this. I caught your last one also with Femregard, who I had on my podcast.
Oh,
so
yeah.
that was a lot of fun, and just appreciate you spreading the word. This is, I think, a great thing just for indie filmmakers to keep learning, especially right now while we have the time. So I appreciate you including me in this.
And do you think, I know it's like one more question, you have just so much knowledge and we're just like melting right now. Do you think it's worth filmmakers to brand themselves on Instagram? Do you think that's a worthy thing of your time? Because it does take time to create content.
Yes. Yeah, I do think it's something that's worth doing. And I think it's worth, in general, branding yourself online, whether it's Instagram, whether it's a podcast, a YouTube channel. There are a lot of different ways to do it. You don't necessarily need to be on every platform, but I think you should choose the platform that's most aligned with you. So if you're a really great writer and you're always coming up with little witty jokes and things like that, you might want to be on Twitter, because if that's kind of the outlet that fits for you, you may build up a really strong audience there. Just like Instagram, if you're comfortable with stories and all that sort of thing, that's a great platform. So I'd say, you don't necessarily have to be on Instagram per se, but I would suggest that all filmmakers start building an audience. I released this whole course on audience building recently because I found I didn't really realize I was building an audience over the years when I launched a blog and a podcast. I just kind of did it for fun. But now I realized it's actually helping me a lot in terms of reaching an audience, raising money for my films and doing all these different things. So I really do recommend that any filmmaker who has the capacity to put out content like you're doing right now, to share with other filmmakers or whatever it may be, it's a great idea, and Instagram is certainly one platform that you can do that on.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you for being on my little IGTV. I really appreciate all the knowledge that you shared.